On our anniversary, my husband gave me divorce papers, I said, looking straight at the candle between us as the flame flickered. And I smiled, because I had already prepared something worse. The dining room smelled like rosemary and slow-cooked beef, the kind of meal that takes 4 hours and a quiet afternoon, the kind of meal you only make when you believe something still matters. The table was set with our wedding china, the same ivory plates with the thin gold rim we received 45 years ago, polished until they reflected the warm light of 2 taper candles standing perfectly upright in their silver holders. The ones my father gave us as a housewarming gift, back when this house was still new and full of promise. I wore the navy dress Charles once said made me look timeless. The one with the small pearl buttons along the sleeve, pressed carefully that morning as if fabric could hold together something that had already begun to fall apart. I remember adjusting the collar just before he walked in, smoothing it with my fingers, telling myself this night would be simple, that we would eat, maybe laugh, maybe remember who we used to be. But when Charles stepped into the room, he didn't look at the table, or the candles, or me, not really. His eyes moved past everything as if he were walking through a place he no longer belonged, and behind him, just half a step too close, stood Brittany, holding a chilled bottle of champagne like she had been invited to celebrate something that hadn't yet been announced. I didn't ask why she was there. I didn't ask anything. I simply pulled out my chair and sat down, folding my hands in my lap the way I always did when I needed to keep them from trembling. Charles cleared his throat, the same small, impatient sound he used to make when waiting for a waiter, and then he placed an envelope on the table between us, sliding it across the polished wood until it stopped just inches from my plate. The paper made a soft, almost polite sound, like it didn't want to disturb the illusion of the evening. "Eleanor," he said, his voice measured, rehearsed, "we need to be practical about this." And I noticed then that he still hadn't touched the chair, hadn't sat down, as if he didn't intend to stay long. Brittany shifted slightly behind him, the faint clink of the champagne bottle against her ring drawing my attention just long enough to see the small, satisfied curve of her lips. I looked down at the envelope, at my name typed neatly across the front, and for a moment I thought about all the years that name had meant something to someone: wife, mother, partner. The quiet center of a life built piece by piece. Then I opened it, slowly, carefully, because there was no reason to rush something that had clearly been planned without me. The pages inside were crisp, legal language arranged in tidy paragraphs, the kind of words that turn decades into assets, memories into liabilities, a marriage into a transaction that could be signed and filed before the ink dried. I didn't read every line. I didn't need to. I had already seen enough in the way Charles avoided my eyes, in the way Brittany stood there like a witness instead of a guest, in the way the room felt colder despite the candles still burning steadily between us. "You'll find everything is fair," Charles continued, as if fairness could be declared like a fact. "We've arranged for you to take your personal belongings, of course, and there's a timeline." I closed the folder before he could finish, placing my hand gently on top of it as if it were something fragile, something that might shatter if handled too roughly. I lifted my eyes to his. And for the first time that evening, he hesitated, just a flicker, just enough to remind me that once, long ago, he had known me well enough to expect something else. I smiled then, not wide, not forced, just a small, calm curve of my lips, the kind of smile that doesn't ask for understanding. "Happy anniversary, Charles," I said softly, and I reached into my bag, the leather one I had carried for years, worn smooth at the edges, and I took out an envelope of my own, heavier, thicker, the paper inside not crisp but lived in, annotated, signed long before this evening was ever imagined. I placed it on the table, sliding it toward him in the same quiet motion he had used, and I watched as his hand hovered above it, uncertain for the first time that night. Brittany leaned forward slightly, curiosity replacing her earlier confidence, her eyes flicking between his face and the envelope as if trying to read something that hadn't yet been revealed. I kept my hand resting lightly on the table, steady now, the trembling long gone, replaced by something colder, something clearer. "Go ahead," I said, my voice even, almost gentle. "You should read that before you finish your speech." And as the candlelight danced between us, casting long shadows across the table we once shared, I realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for him to decide anything at all. Charles did not open the envelope right away, and that hesitation told me more than anything he had said all evening. His fingers rested on the edge of the paper as if it might burn him, while Brittany leaned closer, her perfume cutting through the scent of rosemary and wine, her confidence still intact but thinner now, stretched tight over something uncertain. "What is this supposed to be?" she asked, her tone light but edged, as if she were already preparing to dismiss it. I did not answer her. I never did when she spoke like that. Instead, I reached for my glass and took a slow sip of water, letting the silence settle between us the way it used to on long Sunday mornings when the house was still and the world felt manageable. Charles finally slid the documents out, the soft rustle of paper sounding louder than it should have in a room that had once held laughter, arguments, plans for the future. His eyes moved quickly at first, scanning, confident, then slower, more deliberate. And I watched the exact moment his posture changed, the slight drop in his shoulders, the tightening of his jaw as the words began to register. Brittany shifted again, impatience replacing curiosity. "Charles?" she said, quieter now, searching his face for reassurance he could no longer give her. He did not look at her, not yet. He kept reading, turning each page with less certainty than the last, until finally he stopped, his hand flattening against the table as if he needed something solid to hold on to. "This is not possible," he said, and for the first time that night, his voice was not rehearsed, it was real, unsteady in a way I had not heard in years. I set my glass down carefully, aligning it with the edge of my plate the way I always had, a small habit that once made him smile. "It is very possible," I replied, my tone calm, almost gentle, because anger would have been wasted on a moment like this. Brittany reached across him then, taking one of the pages before he could stop her, her eyes moving quickly, her lips parting as she read, and I could see the calculation returning, but now it was frantic, searching for a way out instead of controlling the room. "This says the house is not fully in your name," she said sharply, looking at Charles, not at me, as if I were no longer the person she needed to convince. "It says there is a trust, and that trust—" Her voice faltered just enough for me to know she understood. I folded my hands again, resting them lightly in my lap, feeling the familiar steadiness settle into my bones, the same steadiness that had carried me through years of small dismissals and quiet exclusions. "My father established that trust before we even moved into this house," I explained, not rushing, not emphasizing, just stating it as plainly as the weather. "He believed in planning ahead, in making sure that what belonged to his daughter would remain hers, no matter how circumstances changed." Charles shook his head, still staring at the document as if it might rearrange itself into something he preferred. "You never told me this," he said, and there was something almost childlike in the accusation. I met his eyes then, holding his gaze without effort. "You never asked?" I said simply, because that was the truth, and the truth, when spoken without decoration, has a way of landing exactly where it should. Brittany straightened, her composure slipping in small, telling ways, the tightening of her grip on the paper, the slight edge in her breathing. "This does not change anything," she insisted, though her voice lacked the certainty it carried earlier. "The divorce still stands, and you cannot just—" "I am not trying to change the divorce," I interrupted softly, not raising my voice, just placing the words between us like another document on the table. "I am acknowledging it." That stopped her, just for a second, long enough for Charles to look up again, confusion replacing whatever plan he thought he had been executing. "Then what is all of this?" he asked, gesturing to the pages, to the signatures, to the careful notations in the margins that had been added long before tonight. I allowed myself a small breath, not a sigh, just a quiet pause, the kind that gives weight to what comes next. "Those are the financial protections tied to the trust," I said, "and the record of every attempt made over the past 6 months to transfer assets out of it without proper authorization." Brittany's eyes snapped to mine then, sharp, defensive. "That is not what happened," she said quickly, too quickly, and I noticed how she avoided looking at the specific page still in her hand. It is exactly what happened, I replied, still calm, still measured. The dates, the requests, the signatures, they are all there, reviewed by a third party who does not have a personal interest in the outcome. Charles pushed his chair back slightly, the legs scraping softly against the floor, a small, ordinary sound that felt strangely final. You went behind my back, he said, and there was a hint of something else now, something like realization, something like regret. I considered that for a moment, then shook my head gently. No, Charles, I said. I finally started paying attention. The candles had burned lower by then, the wax pooling at the base, the light softer, less certain, and for a brief second I saw the table as it had been years ago, crowded, warm, filled with voices that believed they belonged to each other. But that moment passed, and what remained was the quiet, the truth, and the simple understanding that whatever had been built here had already ended long before this night began. The silence did not break right away. It stretched across the table like something alive, something that had been waiting for years to finally be acknowledged. Charles remained standing, his hands still resting on the back of his chair as if he had forgotten how to sit, while Brittany slowly set the papers down, one by one, aligning them with a precision that felt less like control and more like an attempt to regain it. I could see her mind working, moving quickly through possibilities, searching for a version of this evening where she still held the advantage, but there was none left to find. You are overreacting, she said finally, her voice smoother now, carefully composed. This is just a misunderstanding about paperwork. It does not have to turn into something bigger than it is. I let her finish, because people like Brittany always reveal more when they believe they are regaining ground, and then I shook my head once, slowly. It already is something bigger, I said, not looking at her, but at Charles, because he was the one who needed to hear it. He finally lowered himself into the chair, the movement heavy, as if the weight of the years had suddenly caught up with him, and for a moment he looked older than I had ever seen him, not in age but in understanding. How long have you known? He asked, his voice quieter now, stripped of authority, and I did not answer immediately. I let the question sit between us, because the truth deserved its own space. Long enough, I said, and that was all, because anything more would have been unnecessary. Brittany exhaled sharply, a sound of frustration she could not quite hide. This is ridiculous, she said, pushing her chair back slightly. You are acting like we have done something wrong when all we did was try to make things practical for everyone involved. I turned my head then, meeting her eyes directly for the first time that evening, and I noticed how quickly she looked away, just a fraction of a second, but enough. Practical would have been a conversation, I replied, my tone even. Not a series of decisions made without my knowledge, followed by documents placed in front of me like instructions. Charles pressed his fingers against his temple, as if trying to steady his thoughts. We were going to explain everything, he said, but the words lacked conviction, even to him. You were going to inform me, I corrected gently. After everything had already been decided. The candles flickered again, the flame dipping lower as the wax continued to melt, and I found myself noticing small details the way I always did when something important was happening, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, the way Brittany's heel tapped once against the floor before she forced it to stop. So what now? Charles asked, looking at me with a mixture of uncertainty and something that might have been fear, and I understood then that this was the moment he realized the evening was no longer under his control. I folded the divorce papers neatly, aligning the edges, and placed them back into the envelope he had given me, handling them with the same care I had used for everything else in this house for decades. No, I said. We followed the process you started. Brittany let out a short laugh, sharp and disbelieving. You think you can just turn this around? She said. You think a few documents are going to change the outcome? I did not respond to the tone, only to the question. I do not need to turn anything around, I said. The outcome has already been determined, just not in the way you expected. Charles looked down at the papers again, flipping to a page he had already read, as if hoping to find something he had missed. This clause, he said slowly. It says any attempt to Reassign trust-held assets without mutual consent triggers an automatic review. I nodded once, yes. His brow furrowed, the realization deepening. And that review can freeze accounts. Yes. I said again, keeping my voice steady. Brittany's head snapped toward him. What does that mean? She demanded, and he hesitated before answering, because he already knew the implication. It means, he said more quietly than before, that any transfers we initiated could be paused. Paused? She repeated, her voice rising just slightly, the controls slipping again. Or reversed? He did not answer right away, and that silence was answer enough. I reached for my napkin, smoothing it across my lap, a small, familiar gesture that grounded me in the present. There will be a formal review, I explained, by an independent party. And until that review is complete, nothing moves, not the house, not the accounts, not the investments. Brittany shook her head, stepping back from the table as if distance might change what she was hearing. This is insane, she said. You are trying to trap us in some legal technicality. I considered her words for a moment, then replied, No, Brittany, I am relying on the same system you believed would work in your favor. Charles closed the folder slowly, his movements careful now. Deliberate, and when he looked up at me again, there was no confidence left, only a quiet recognition of the situation he had stepped into. You planned this, he said, not accusing, not admiring, just stating it. I held his gaze steady and calm. I prepared, I said, because that was the truth, and preparation, unlike surprise, does not require an apology. Charles did not argue after that, and that, more than anything, told me the evening had shifted beyond recovery. He sat there with the folder closed in front of him, his fingers resting lightly on the cover as if it no longer belonged to him, while Brittany paced once behind his chair before stopping, her posture rigid, her mind still searching for a way to undo what had already been set in motion. The room felt smaller now. Not physically, but in the way truth compresses space, leaving no room for performance or pretense. There has to be a way to fix this, she said finally, her voice lower, controlled again but tighter, as if every word required effort. We can amend the filings, we can clarify intent, this does not have to escalate. I watched her for a moment, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet observation I had learned over years of listening more than speaking. It already escalated when decisions were made without me. I said, my tone unchanged. What you are seeing now is simply the result. Charles exhaled slowly, the sound heavy, resigned. Eleanor, he began, and I noticed how he said my name differently now, without the casual familiarity he had used for decades. We did not think it would go this far. I nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing with it, because what he meant was not that they did not think, but that they did not think it would matter. That is often how things go, I replied. Until they do. Brittany stepped closer to the table again, placing her hands on the back of the chair as if grounding herself. You are making this unnecessarily difficult, she said, and there was a trace of frustration that slipped through despite her effort to remain composed. We were trying to move forward, to create something stable, something that made sense for the future. I considered that word, future, the way she used it as if it were something she had already claimed, something she could shape without regard for what came before. A future built on exclusion is not stability, I said quietly. It is just a different form of imbalance. Charles looked down again, his gaze lingering on the envelope he had given me earlier, now resting beside my plate, untouched since I had closed it, and I could see the moment he understood that what he had brought to the table was no longer the defining document of the night. What happens next? He asked, and there was no challenge in the question now, only a need for direction. I adjusted the sleeve of my dress slightly, smoothing the fabric over my wrist, a small motion that gave me time to answer without rushing. The review process begins, I said. You will be contacted by the firm overseeing the trust. They will request documentation, clarification, timelines, and until that process is complete, everything remains as it is. Brittany let out a soft, incredulous breath. And you are just going to sit back and watch? She asked, as if still expecting some emotional reaction she could respond to, something she could push against. I met her gaze again, steady, unflinching. "No," I said. "I am going to participate, appropriately, as I should have from the beginning." The clock on the wall ticked forward, marking seconds that felt heavier than they should have, and for a brief moment none of us spoke. The silence settling into something less tense and more final. Charles pushed the folder slightly away from him, not dramatically, just enough to create distance. "I did not want it to end like this," he said. And there was a sincerity in his voice that might have mattered once, years ago, when intentions still held weight. I listened, not interrupting, not dismissing, because understanding does not require agreement. "It did not end tonight," I replied. "It has been ending for a long time." Brittany straightened, her expression shifting again, this time towards something sharper, more defensive. "That is convenient," she said. "To rewrite history now that you have leverage." I shook my head gently. "I am not rewriting anything," I said. "I am finally reading it clearly." Charles closed his eyes for a moment, just briefly, as if absorbing the weight of that statement, and when he opened them again, there was a quiet acceptance there, not of defeat, but of reality. "So this is it," he said, and it was not a question. I looked at the table, at the candles that had nearly burned down, at the meal that had gone untouched, at the place settings that once represented something shared, and I felt no urgency, no panic, only a calm certainty that comes when something unresolved finally reaches its conclusion. "This is the beginning of what comes next," I said, because endings, when seen clearly, are simply transitions we can no longer ignore. Brittany picked up her coat then, the movement abrupt, controlled, as if she needed to reclaim some sense of momentum. "We are not done here," she said, her voice firm, but thinner than before, and I did not respond, because there was nothing left to argue. Charles remained seated for a moment longer, looking at me as if trying to find something familiar in a situation that no longer held it, and then he stood, slowly, carefully, the way people do when they realize the ground beneath them has shifted. I stayed where I was, my hands resting lightly in my lap, my posture unchanged, because for the first time in a very long time, I was exactly where I needed to be. They did not leave immediately, and that pause lingered longer than anything that had been said, stretching the moment into something neither of them seemed prepared to step out of. Brittany adjusted her coat again, smoothing the sleeve with quick, precise movements that betrayed the tension she was trying to contain, while Charles remained standing beside his chair, his hand hovering near the backrest as if he had forgotten whether he meant to sit down again or walk away. I stayed where I was, watching them with the same quiet attention I had learned over the years, noticing how different they looked now that the certainty had drained from the room. "We should go," Brittany said finally, her voice firm but quieter, directed at Charles rather than at me, and that small shift in focus told me more than anything else, because it meant she no longer saw me as someone she could manage. Charles nodded once, slowly, but did not move right away, his gaze drifting back to the table, to the place where the candles had nearly burned down to their bases, to the untouched plates, to the evening that had been planned for something entirely different. "Eleanor," he said, and there was a hesitation in his voice that had not been there before, a kind of carefulness, as if each word now required thought. "We will need to speak again, about everything." I considered that, not dismissing it, not accepting it outright, simply letting the idea settle where it belonged. "Through the appropriate channels," I replied, my tone even, because this was no longer a conversation that belonged to this table. Brittany let out a small breath, almost a laugh but without humor. "You really are going to make this formal?" she said, shaking her head slightly, as if she still could not quite believe the direction this had taken. I met her gaze for a moment, steady and unhurried. "It became formal the moment you put it in writing," I said, and I saw the flicker of recognition in her expression, brief but unmistakable. Charles reached for the folder again, then stopped himself, leaving it where it was, as if he understood now that it no longer belonged to him in the way he had intended. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said, and the sentence hung there, incomplete, not because it needed more words, but because it arrived too late to carry weight. I listened, not interrupting, not challenging, because there was no need to argue with something that no longer held influence. Intent does not change outcome, I said quietly, and that was all. Brittany shifted her weight, her heel tapping once against the floor before she forced it still again, the small sound echoing slightly in the quiet room. We should go, she repeated, more firmly this time, and Charles finally stepped away from the table, the movement slow, deliberate, as if each step required adjustment to a reality he had not expected. They moved toward the door together, Brittany leading by half a step, Charles following, and I remained seated, my hands resting lightly in my lap, my posture unchanged, because there was no reason to follow them out, no reason to fill the silence with anything more. At the doorway, Charles paused, turning back just slightly, his expression unreadable for a moment before settling into something quieter, something more reflective. You seem different, he said, and I understood what he meant, even if he could not fully articulate it. I allowed myself a small pause before answering, not out of hesitation, but out of clarity. I am, I said, because change does not need explanation when it has already taken place. Brittany did not look back. She opened the door, the cool evening air slipping into the room, carrying with it the faint sound of distant traffic and something else, something like movement beyond the walls that had held so many years. Charles gave a small nod, not quite agreement, not quite farewell, and then he stepped out the door, closing behind them with a soft, final click that seemed louder in the quiet that followed. I sat there for a moment longer, listening to the absence they left behind, noticing how the house felt not emptier, but clearer, as if something that had been pressing against it for years had finally been removed. The candles burned low, their flames steady despite the open air that had briefly disturbed them, and I reached forward, one at a time, gently extinguishing them, watching the thin trails of smoke curl upward before disappearing. The room settled into a softer light, the edges less defined, the details less demanding, and I allowed myself a single, slow breath, not of relief, but of recognition. I stood. Then, carefully, smoothing the front of my dress the way I had earlier that evening, the fabric still neat, still composed, and I began to clear the table, not hurried, not burdened, just methodical, placing each plate in the sink, stacking each utensil with quiet precision, because some habits do not disappear simply because circumstances change. When I reached the two envelopes, I paused, looking at them side by side, one thin, one heavy, both carrying different versions of the same story. And I picked up mine, sliding it back into my bag, leaving the other where it was, because it no longer required my attention. The clock on the wall ticked forward, steady, indifferent, marking the continuation of something that had not ended, only shifted, and as I turned off the light above the table, the room fell into a calm, even darkness that felt less like loss and more like space. The kind of space that comes when something unresolved finally finds its place. The house was quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar, not empty in the emotional sense, but settled, as if it had finally stopped holding its breath. I moved through the kitchen with steady, unhurried motions, placing the last of the dishes into the sink, letting the warm water run over my hands while I watched the faint reflections of the ceiling light ripple across the surface. There was no urgency anymore. No need to anticipate interruption or explanation, only the simple rhythm of cleaning what had been used and closing what had been opened. When I finished, I dried my hands on a linen towel and stood still for a moment, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of the wall clock, sounds I had heard every day for years but only now seemed fully present. I did not sleep immediately that night, not because of distress, but because my mind was no longer racing, it was organizing. Sorting events into place the way one might arrange papers into a file that finally makes sense. Sometime after midnight, I heard my phone vibrate softly on the counter, a single call that displayed an unfamiliar number, and after a brief pause I answered it. The voice on the other end introduced herself as Margaret Ellis, a senior administrator from the legal oversight firm assigned to review the trust documentation, her tone professional, precise, but not unkind. She confirmed receipt of the preliminary filing I had submitted earlier that evening, and informed me that certain financial actions initiated in the past 6 months had triggered an automatic compliance review. Exactly as outlined in the trust agreement. I listened without interruption, my attention steady, asking only for clarification when necessary, not because I was uncertain, but because precision mattered now more than emotion. She explained that Charles Whitmore had attempted to initiate partial asset restructuring without co-signatory authorization, and that Brittany Whitmore's involvement had been documented in supporting correspondence. There was no accusation in her voice, only procedure, but procedure has its own weight, its own consequences. When she finished, I thanked her and ended the call. Placing the phone back on the counter without hesitation, I stood there for a moment longer, looking out into the dimly lit kitchen, and I realized how strange it was that clarity often arrives without noise. The following morning, sunlight entered the house in soft, angled lines across the floor, illuminating everything without distortion, and I found myself moving more slowly than usual, not from fatigue, but from awareness. I made coffee, not out of habit alone, but because the act itself grounded me in something familiar, and as I poured it into a plain white mug, I heard a knock at the front door. It was not forceful, not uncertain, but measured, the kind of knock that assumes permission to be acknowledged. When I opened it, I found Daniel standing there, my son, his expression drawn in a way I had not seen in some time, his eyes shifting briefly past me into the house before returning to my face. He looked older than I remembered from our last conversation, not in age, but in posture, as if something had been weighing on him longer than he had admitted. "Mom," he said quietly, and there was hesitation in the way he said it, as if unsure whether the words still carried the same meaning. I stepped aside, not inviting, not resisting, simply allowing entry as one does when the moment has already been decided. He walked in slowly, pausing near the threshold of the kitchen, his gaze moving over the table, the chairs, the remnants of the previous night still absent but somehow present in memory. "I heard what happened," he said finally, his voice lower than usual, controlled but strained, and I noticed how carefully he chose each word, as if testing whether they would hold. I placed my mug down and looked at him fully, not searching for guilt or justification, but for understanding. "Then you know the process has begun," I said evenly, and he nodded once, though it was not clear whether he agreed or simply acknowledged. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I remembered from when he was younger, when uncertainty still had visible signs. "Dad says this is being taken too far," he said, then hesitated, as if realizing too late how incomplete that statement sounded. I did not respond immediately, because there was nothing to correct in it, only something to observe. "Your father is part of the process," I said gently. "Not outside it." Daniel looked down at the counter, at the clean surface, at the absence of chaos that might have matched his expectation. "I did not think it would become this formal," he admitted, and there was something in his voice that sounded closer to regret than defense. I nodded slightly. "Formal is simply what happens when informal decisions are made without everyone present," I said, not harshly, not softly, just clearly. He exhaled slowly, shifting his weight. "What happens now?" he asked, and for the first time that morning I allowed myself a small pause before answering, not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted the truth to be understood in full. "No," I said. "Everything is reviewed, documented, and resolved according to what was already established long before this conversation began." He looked at me then, really looked, and I saw at the moment he realized this was not a reaction, not an emotional turn, but a continuation of something already in motion. Outside, the light continued to shift across the yard, steady and indifferent, and inside the house, nothing had changed in appearance, but everything had changed in structure, as if the foundation itself had finally been acknowledged for what it was. Daniel stood in the kitchen longer than I expected, as if waiting for the house itself to give him a different answer than the one I had already spoken. His hands stayed loosely at his sides, but I noticed the tension in his fingers, the way they curled slightly and then relaxed again, repeating a cycle of hesitation that matched the silence between us. "Mom," he said again, softer this time, as if the word itself might help rebuild something that had already shifted. "Dad thinks this can still be resolved privately." I looked at him without surprise, because that sentence had the shape of something rehearsed elsewhere before being delivered here, and I nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement that I had heard it. Most things can be resolved privately, I said calmly. Until they are not. He exhaled, turning his gaze toward the window where the morning light had begun to stretch further into the room, touching the edge of the counter where I had set my coffee. Brittany is very upset, he added, almost cautiously, as if testing whether her name still carried influence in this space. I paused at that, not because it mattered in the emotional sense he might have expected, but because it confirmed a pattern I had already observed. Brittany is involved in the process that triggered the review, I said evenly. Her reaction is consistent with that involvement. Daniel looked at me then, really looked, and there was something unsettled in his expression, not anger. Not disagreement, but a dawning recognition that I was no longer responding in the way he anticipated. You sound like a lawyer, he said quietly, and there was a faint attempt at humor in it, but it did not land. I allowed a small pause before answering. I am speaking with clarity, I said, because confusion benefits no one now. The phone on the counter vibrated again, and I saw the same legal firm's name appear on the screen, so I lifted it without hesitation. Margaret Ellis's voice came through again, measured and professional, informing me that additional documentation had been received overnight from financial institutions connected to the Whitmore accounts, and that discrepancies had been identified requiring formal clarification from all signatories. I listened carefully, asking only for confirmation of timelines and procedural steps, while Daniel stood a few feet away, watching me with a growing sense of distance he could not yet name. When the call ended, I placed the phone down and turned slightly toward him. There will be a scheduled review meeting within 72 hours, I said, attended by legal representatives from all parties involved. Daniel frowned slightly. All parties? He repeated, and I could see him processing that this was no longer contained within the family structure he understood. Yes, I said, including your father and Brittany, as well as independent oversight counsel. He ran his hand down the side of his face, a slow gesture of stress rather than disbelief. This is going to destroy what is left of the family, he said quietly, and I studied him for a moment before responding. What you are describing as destruction is actually exposure, I said, and those two things are not the same. He shook his head slightly, not in argument, but in difficulty accepting the distinction. I just do not understand why it had to go this far, he said, and I could hear in his voice that he was still searching for a point where this could have been stopped earlier. I walked to the counter and picked up my mug again, taking a slow sip before answering. Because understanding requires information, and information was not shared with me when decisions were made, I said, placing the mug back down. I am not extending this situation, Daniel. I am allowing it to complete itself properly. He looked down at the floor for a moment, then back at me. Dad is going to want to speak to you directly, he said, and I nodded once. Then he will. I replied simply. There was another silence after that, not uncomfortable, but heavy with adjustment, as if he was recalibrating his understanding of me in real time. Finally, he stepped closer, but not too close, maintaining a respectful distance that had not been necessary before. Are you okay? He asked, and the question, unlike the others, did not carry strategy or defense, only uncertainty. I considered it honestly before answering. I am steady, I said, and steadiness is what is required now. He nodded slowly, absorbing that without reply, and I could see that he was beginning to understand that the structure he had assumed was collapsing into something more formal, more defined, and less negotiable than he had expected. When he finally left, the door closing behind him with the same quiet finality as the night before, I remained in the kitchen for a moment, listening to the absence he left behind, and then I began preparing the day, not as something new, but as something continuing along a path that had already been set in motion long before anyone in this house had realized it. The morning after Daniel left felt different, not because anything in the house had changed physically, but because the space itself seemed to understand that denial was no longer possible. I moved through my routine with steady precision, preparing tea, reviewing printed documents, and organizing the correspondence that had arrived earlier from the Legal Oversight Office, each page marked with timestamps, reference numbers, and procedural notes that replaced emotion with structure. At exactly 10:30 in the morning, my phone rang again, and this time I did not need to check the screen to know who it would be. Charles's name appeared, and I answered on the second ring. His voice came through controlled but strained, carrying none of the rehearsed certainty he once used when making decisions on behalf of others. "Eleanor, we need to meet in person," he said, and I could hear faint background noise, the kind of muffled office sound that suggested he was no longer at ease anywhere he stood. I did not respond immediately, not out of hesitation, but out of allowing the moment its full weight. "There will be a scheduled review meeting," I said calmly, repeating what had already been established. "All communication will proceed through formal channels until that time." There was a pause on the line, longer than I expected, and when he spoke again his tone shifted slightly, less directive, more uncertain. "This is not just paperwork anymore," he said. "This is affecting everything." I stood by the kitchen counter, looking at the empty space where breakfast had been, my hand resting lightly on the edge of the surface. "It has always been everything," I replied. "The difference is that it is now documented." Another silence followed, and I could hear him breathe on the other end, slower now, less controlled. "Brittany is insisting that there has been a misunderstanding," he added, as if delivering information that might still carry influence. I nodded slightly even though he could not see it. "Then she will have the opportunity to clarify that during the review," I said. The call ended shortly after, not abruptly, but with the quiet realization that further conversation would not change the framework already in place. I placed the phone down and turned toward the living room where sunlight had shifted across the floorboards, marking time in a way that felt more honest than any conversation I had had that week. By noon, a courier arrived with additional sealed envelopes from the oversight firm, each labeled with formal headings and reference codes that confirmed the process was now fully active. I signed for them without hesitation, thanking the driver politely before closing the door and returning to the table where I laid them out in order. Each document added another layer of clarity, not of accusation, but of structure, mapping financial movements, authorization chains, and timing inconsistencies that had previously been scattered across months of informal decisions. I read through them carefully, not with surprise, but with the same steady attention one gives to something finally being understood in full. Later that afternoon, Daniel returned briefly. Not entering this time but standing at the threshold, his expression more restrained than before, as if he had already begun adjusting to a reality he could not reverse. "They are preparing for the review," he said quietly, and I nodded once, acknowledging without elaboration. He hesitated, then added, "Dad says this is becoming public enough that it will not stay contained within family discussions." And I recognized in his words the beginning of external consequence entering what had once been assumed private. "That is correct," I replied evenly. "Which is why structure matters now more than interpretation." He looked at me for a long moment, then lowered his gaze slightly. "I did not think it would reach this point," he admitted again, and I understood that he was still measuring cause and effect against expectation rather than against evidence. "Most systems appear stable until they are examined," I said, not as a warning, but as a statement of fact. He nodded once, slowly, then stepped back toward the door, pausing only briefly before leaving. As the afternoon continued, I remained at the table, organizing each document into its respective category, not because it was necessary for me to do so, but because clarity requires order when so many others are still adjusting to its arrival. Outside, the light began to soften, shifting toward evening, and I realized that for the first time in a long while, nothing in my environment required interpretation, only acknowledgement, and that alone was enough to carry the remainder of the day forward. The evening arrived without ceremony, moving slowly through the house as if it, too, understood that nothing in the last 24 hours required urgency anymore. I was seated at the dining table when the official notification came through, not as a dramatic interruption, but as a simple, expected confirmation delivered by email and followed by a brief phone call from Margaret Ellis. Her voice was as composed as ever, but there was a subtle shift in tone that suggested finality had begun to settle into the process. "The preliminary review has been completed," she said. and all actions initiated without proper authorization have been formally suspended pending final determination. I listened without interruption, my hands resting calmly beside the printed documents I had already organized earlier that day, each page aligned with quiet precision. There was no surprise in me, only acknowledgement, because nothing she said contradicted what had already been established in the structure of the trust. Charles Whitmore and Brittany Whitmore have been notified, she continued, and a formal hearing has been scheduled within 72 hours to determine corrective measures and asset restoration terms. I thanked her politely and ended the call, placing the phone face down on the table before looking toward the window where the last light of the day was fading into soft gray. Not long after, another knock came at the door, this one more controlled than before, and when I opened it, I found Charles standing alone. Brittany was not with him. His posture was different now, less certain, more contained, as if he had spent the last several hours learning the limits of control he once believed he held. I stepped aside without comment, allowing him to enter, and he walked into the living room slowly, stopping near the center as though unsure where he was permitted to stand. For a moment neither of us spoke, and the silence was not heavy, only complete. I received the notice, he said finally, his voice lower than I remembered. Everything has been suspended. I nodded once, not in agreement, but in confirmation that I was aware. He looked around the room briefly, as if searching for something familiar to anchor himself to, then returned his gaze to me. This is going to affect everything, he said, and there was no longer any attempt to disguise the weight of that realization. I remained seated, my hands folded lightly, my posture unchanged. It was always going to affect everything, I replied calmly. The only difference is that now it is visible. He exhaled slowly, lowering his eyes for a moment before speaking again. Brittany is saying this was misrepresented, he said, and I could hear the effort in his voice to maintain alignment with a narrative that was no longer stable. Then she will have the opportunity to present that interpretation during the hearing, I said evenly. He looked up at that, and for the first time there was no immediate response, only silence that suggested he was no longer certain which language still applied to this situation. After a moment, he spoke again, more quietly. Daniel has been asking questions, and I understood immediately that the structure of influence he had relied on was no longer functioning as expected. That is appropriate, I said. Questions are part of clarification. Charles nodded slightly, though the motion lacked conviction, and he stepped a little closer to the table, then stopped, as if reconsidering even that small movement. I did not expect it to reach this level, he said, and I observed him carefully, not with judgment, but with clarity, because expectation and outcome are often separated only by attention. It reached this level the moment decisions were made without inclusion, I replied, my tone steady, without emphasis. He closed his eyes briefly, then reopened them, and I saw something in his expression shift, not toward resistance, but toward acceptance that was still in formation. What happens after the hearing? He asked, and this time the question carried less certainty. About his own position, I took a slow breath, not because I needed to prepare, but because precision required patience. After the hearing, I said, the terms of compliance will be enforced, and the trust will continue under its original structure, with corrections applied only where unauthorized actions occurred. There was no reaction immediately, only a quiet processing, and I could see that he understood enough to recognize the boundaries of what could no longer be altered. He looked down once more, then back at me. So it is finished, he said, though it sounded more like realization than statement. I considered that carefully before responding. No, I said gently. It is simply aligned with what was always intended. He remained standing for a moment longer, then slowly nodded, and when he finally turned toward the door, there was no urgency in his movement, only the measured acceptance of someone adjusting to a structure that no longer bends to expectation. After he left, I remained at the table, listening to the quiet return of the house around me, noticing how stillness no longer felt uncertain, only complete, and as the final light faded from the windows, I understood that nothing had been taken from me in the end, only revealed.